Wij dachten, na de val van de muur, dat het westerse vrije marktmodel zou zegevieren. Maar zij kopen nu onze bedrijven op. Wij dachten dat iedereen bij ons wilde komen intrekken. Maar onze beste mensen vertrekken nu naar het oosten. Wij dachten dat we de wereld hadden ingericht. Maar zij geven nu de nieuwe wereldvorm. Die ontwikkeling noemen we reversed globalization. Ofwel, de wereld op zijn kop. Deze week een ontmoeting met Kishore Mahbubani. Kishore Mahbubani werkte 33 jaar lang als ambassadeur van Singapore. De Aziatische stadstaat die in 30 jaar met harde hand tot economische voorspoed werd gedwongen door de autocratische leider Lee Kuan Yew. Singapore wordt een politiestaat genoemd, maar ook een economisch wonder. De huidige Chinese leiders beschouwen Singapore in ieder geval als hun grote voorbeeld.
Democracy worship is a sacred cow in Western thinking.
Net als Lee Kuan Yew stelt Mahbubani eerst economische welvaart en dan democratie. Mahbubani's ervaringen met de wereldpolitiek reiken van oost naar west.
Too many Western minds are looking at dangers. Few are looking at opportunities.
Hij was ambassadeur van Singapore in achtereenvolgens Cambodja, Maleisië en Washington D.C.
The capacity of the West to dominate the world is coming to an end.
In New York werkte Mahbubani als Singaporees ambassadeur bij de Verenigde Naties. In 2001 en 2002 was hij voorzitter van de Veiligheidsraad. Uiteindelijk keerde hij terug naar Singapore om een rector te worden van de Lee Kuan Yew School for Public Policy, waar een nieuwe Aziatische bestuurselite wordt opgeleid.
The vast majority of the world's population has no desire to become carbon copies of the West, and indeed want to evolve their own societies by borrowing some of the Western best practices, but not necessarily all of them.
Onlangs verscheen zijn boek The New Asian Hemisphere, waarin hij de gevolgen beschrijft van de onvermijdelijke opkomst van India en China.
Mr. Mahbubani, according to your new book, this is the way the world is going to look like?
Mm-hmm. Oh yes, I mean this is a much more natural map of the world, because from the year 1 to the year 1820, the two largest economies in the world were China and India for 18 centuries. It's only in the last 200 years that Europe took off and then North America took off. So when you come back to the 21st century, we come back to the historical norm, where by the year 2050, the 4 largest economies in the world will be number 1, China, number 2, India, number 3, United States of America, number 4, Japan. So this is the natural center of the world.
Your last book is called The New Asian Hemisphere, The Irresistible Shift of Global Power to the East. What does the title mean?
The title means that we are entering a completely new era of world history. For the last 200 years, world history has been dominated initially by Europe and then by America, combined together in the West. The West will remain the single strongest civilization for a long, long time to come. But the capacity of the West to dominate the world is coming to an end. And the problem the world faces is that there is a natural psychological reluctance to give up power when you've enjoyed it for so long. You know, for a long time, many Western intellectuals believe that as societies modernize, that they will automatically become westernized. And as you know, one of the revolutionary things I say in my book is I distinguish between modernization And I say in Asia, with modernization, you don't get westernization, you get modernization and de-westernization. And that, I know, is creating a great deal of cultural anxiety in the West. And that's where the European intellectuals have got to understand how history has changed, how the world is so different from the way that they could dominate the rest of the world. And it's easiest to illustrate this with a very simple, clear examples. We're now in the 21st century, but we still have a rule that says to become the head of the most powerful world's economic institutions, okay? To become the head of the IMF, you must be a European. To become the head of the World Bank, you must be an American. And 3.5 billion Asians don't qualify, even though they have the world's fastest growing economies, the world's largest pool of foreign reserves, now producing more PhDs in economics than anybody else, and no Asian qualifies. I mean, this is completely absurd. But the fact that such an absurdity continues shows the reluctance of the West to give up its domination of the world. You know, if you look at the IMF voting, you know, how can Belgium have a larger share of voting in the IMF than China? Come on. You have to come out of the 19th and 20th century mental maps that you have had. Your assumption that, you know, we can do whatever we want. We don't have to adjust. We don't have to adapt. We can make the demands on the world cannot make demands on us. And that change in mindset hasn't happened yet. As a frequent traveler to Western intellectual gatherings, I often come away from them astonished that at a time when Western minds should be opening themselves to completely new realities, they are actually becoming more closed. I often despair when I read the op-ed pages of the New York Times and the Financial Times. These newspapers are filled with an incestuous discourse among minds who believe that 12% of the world's population who live in the West can continue to dominate the remaining 88% who live outside the West. Few in the West have grasped the full implications of the two most salient features of our historical epoch. We will see an enormous renaissance of Asian societies. The strategic discourse in the West should focus on how the West should adapt, but this has not happened. I think, you know, at the end of the Cold War, that was one of the most triumphal moments for the Western spirit. I mean, it felt wonderful for United States and Europe to have defeated the entire great Soviet empire without firing a shot. And the belief was that the West had triumphed. And, you know, you had the famous essay by Francis Fukuyama, The End of History, which more or less said that the rest of the world had no choice but to become carbon copies of the West. Now, that dangerous mindset, which refuses to acknowledge that other societies are different, that the vast majority of the world's population has no desire to become carbon copies of the West, and indeed want to evolve their own societies by borrowing some of the Western best practices, but not necessarily all of them. We are moving from a mono-civilizational world to a multi-civilizational world, from one successful civilization to many successful civilizations. And these other successful civilizations are not carbon copies of the West. they look at the world very differently. You have to reach out and understand them. And the pragmatic spirit is one which says, hey, you may not be like me, but I can try to understand you. I can try to figure out how you work, what you do, and so on and so forth. Up to now, especially since the end of the Cold War, the Western mind has become very ideological in its belief that there is only one path of history. Now suddenly there are many different paths of history. And your mind has got to open up to those possibilities. And that's why I say you need a new spirit of pragmatism to infect the Western mind.
It sounds like a nightmare for Western minds, actually.
No, I hope it's not a nightmare, because, the reason why Asian societies are succeeding now is because they have finally understood, absorbed, and are beginning to implement 7 pillars of Western wisdom. Now, excuse me, if I say that the rise of Asia is due to Asians implementing Western pillars of wisdom, it's not anti-West. And more importantly, I do say that the rest of the world, in many ways, right, want to replicate the successful Western middle-class society. They don't want to dominate the West. They have no desire to do so because they don't have to do so.
When you say these economies started thriving because of implementing the 7 pillars of Western wisdom, what kind of pillars are they?
Well, let me cite some obvious ones. The first and most obvious one is free market economics, I happened to be in China in 1980 for the first time in my life. And China was still Maoist. And the reforms had just barely begun. And I went for a haircut in Beijing. And the barber gave me a wonderful haircut, It took 1 hour to do it. So when he finished, I said, "Thank you very much, but why do you take so long?" He says, "Well, whether I do 5 haircuts, 10 haircuts, 20 haircuts, I get paid the same. So what's the hurry?" Right? There was an iron rice bowl. China's economy didn't grow. But the minute China smashed the iron rice bowl and created free market incentives, China has now had the world's fastest growing economy for over 30 years, just by implementing free market economics. And watching the world's most populous country, China, 1.3 billion people, to watch it have the fastest growing economy in the world is as unnatural as watching the fattest boy in class winning the 100-meter race, right? It's quite remarkable, but that shows the power of free market economics. Then you take science and technology, right? The reason why the West was able to dominate the world was because it has always had been a superior edge in science and technology. But today, a remarkable shift is taking place. And in doing research for my book, I came across a Time magazine cover story which said by 2010, 90% of all PhD holders in science and engineering will be Asians.
That's in 2 years.
Yeah. And it may not be 90%, but it's a remarkable shift. And today, if you go to American universities and you look at the list of the PhD graduates, they're all mainly Asian names. It's clear at the basic science research, Asia hasn't caught up yet. There's no doubt whatsoever. But the Asians are making massive investments in those areas. You take biotechnology, for example. I was stunned when the provost of Harvard came to Singapore and came to call on me in my office. I said, "Why are you coming to Asia? Harvard is number 1 in the world, right?" He says, "We understand that there is very powerful new research going on in this region, and we want to understand what's going on." Now that, I spent a year in Harvard in 91, 92. In 1991, 92, no Harvard provost would have come to Asia to say, "Hey, I want to understand what's happening in Asia." The fact that today he's coming shows something is happening in Asia, even in the fields of basic scientific research. Another one is what I call meritocracy. And to understand meritocracy, I use the example of Brazil. Why is Brazil always a soccer superpower, but in economic terms, a middle power? And the simple reason is that when it comes to looking for football talent, the Brazilians go to the upper class, middle class, lower class, and they even go into the slums. And the people at the very bottom, they say, if they can find a boy that can kick a ball, they say, come play for Brazil. But when it comes to economic talent, they look in the upper class, middle class, then they more or less stop there. And the big shift in Asia is that the Asians have finally realized that they have talent in the hundreds of millions of people at the very bottom. So the simplest explanation for why Asia is rising now is that Asia always had the world's largest pool of brain power, but it also had the world's largest pool of unused brain power. Now that unused brain power is being used, and that is fueling this powerful growth in Asia. And that's something also that the Asians have learned from the West, that you find talent in all segments of society.
What surprised me in your book is that one of the pillars that I would expect you to include, you didn't include, which is democracy. Mm-hmm. Why is that?
Well, I deliberately did not include democracy because the lesson that Asians have learned is that the critical variable in development is neither democracy nor lack of it. You can have a non-democratic society like China succeeding, and you can have a non-democratic society like North Korea failing. You can have a democratic society like India succeeding, and then maybe a democratic society like Philippines not succeeding. So the critical variable in development is not democracy or lack of it. The critical variable is good governance. And that, I think, is what the Asian states should be focused on. And what's interesting about Asia, this is why the Asian story is so fascinating, is that there is no single role model. China is one role model, India is another role model, and they are very different, right? And it's important to understand the diversity of Asia. And for the Asian countries that want to succeed, they have to focus on the elements of good governance. And that's why I say they can implement the 7 pillars of Western wisdom. And by the way, I emphasize the importance of rule of law. I think if you can have rule of law to create a secure environment, and especially a secure environment, as you know, for property and intellectual property, that makes a big difference in terms of growth and development. So frankly, I would say, you're given a choice between going for democracy immediately or rule of law immediately, I say go for rule of law first. Develop your society, and then we will all have to go to democracy.
But where do I see that rule of law in China, for instance?
Well, good question. If you look at where China was in Maoist times, right? And look at where China is today, right? One of the most precious things that you saw in the American Revolution, as you know, is that they believe in private property. Today, a lot of Chinese have private property. which is protected by the laws of the state and cannot be seized easily. That's why the Chinese economy is growing. If you look at the country that is producing the largest amount of new judges, it's China. And you know what the judges are studying? They're trying to study Western concepts of law and trying to apply it. Because the Chinese government knows that if they don't have rule of law, China will not go to the next stage of economic development. And the higher the stages you go, right? And if you want to attract world-class industries to invest in China, you have to protect intellectual property. Now, the record is a mixed one, but the fact that every year the trend line is positive, and that's what has to happen in all the new Asian states.
So basically what you're saying to Western intellectuals is don't preach what the situation should be, but look at what has happened over 20 years.
Look at the trend line. I mean, are these societies progressing, changing, opening up? And listen to the voices of their people. I take a very small indicator, right? For a long time, there was a brain drain, right, from Asia to the West. And which was a good thing in many ways. I remember the former Prime Minister of India, Rajiv Gandhi, was asked, aren't you worried about a brain drain? And he gave a brilliant reply. He said, better a brain drain than a brain in the drain. So if these brains can be used and nurtured and developed, they have become potential long-term assets for the Asian economies. And today, guess what? You see a reverse brain drain taking place. You see people with PhDs from American universities going back to India. And guess what? Going back to China. Why? Now, if China was a closed society, an oppressive society with no freedom, why are the best brains coming back to work in Chinese universities? And you know, every year, over 20 million Chinese travel overseas. And you know what? Over 20 million Chinese return home. You don't get what you did in the Soviet Union days. You know, when the Soviets, whenever they had a chance to leave, they would jump ship and seek asylum. Very few Chinese are seeking asylum. They're all going home.
Lee Kuan Yew, founder of Singapore, said economy first and then possibly democracy. But still to Western ears that sounds like there is something painful in that, in the way that it sounds.
You know, I'm glad you said that it sounds painful to the Western ear, because it shows how little the West has studied its own history. I mean, the longest democracy in the world is American democracy, right? They preached the concept of equality of man in 1776. Guess what? It took them almost 100 years, right, to get rid of slavery. It took them 150 years to give the women the right to vote. And it took them almost 200 years till 1960s before the blacks got the effective right to vote. 200 years. Now, if America took 200 years from very auspicious beginnings to achieve full democracy, if China does it in 50 years, pretty fast, isn't it? Pretty good, right? So why do you expect China to be able to do it overnight? You know, the critical thing is that are these societies opening up and going in the right direction? I mean, certainly Myanmar is going in the wrong direction. No one doubts it. There's no development, no change whatsoever. But China is going in the right direction. So, but this is why many Asians believe that when the West preaches to China there's some other agenda going on here. Because why can't you see the obvious improvements in China? The real agenda is that you're frightened of China's rise. You're worried of China's rise. And you're trying to look at the deficiencies. And every society's got deficiencies. And in the area of human rights, I actually believe that the whole world should move towards more progressive respect of human rights. We should, in fact, implement the principles of the Universal Human Rights Declaration. I believe in that too. But even the record has been clearly seen, and this is something that the West is not aware of, is that the West has got so many double standards on human rights. The rest of the world sees your double standards. You don't see your double standards and you continue preaching. If Western intellectuals continue to have what I call an incestuous, self-referential, self-congratulatory dialogue among themselves, where they reinforce each other's, prejudice against the rest of the world, then it's very dangerous.
Is that something you see very often?
Oh, I see it every day. I mean, if you open the newspapers, any international newspapers, International Herald Tribune, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and look at the amount of lectures they give to China, right? About how China must change, must adapt. Excuse me. The Chinese have had the world's fastest growing economy for 30 years. The Chinese have opened up their society in a profound way. Indeed, one of the most shocking statements I quote is from an Indian intellectual, right? Pratap Bhanu Mehta, who says, the difference between China and India is that India is an open society with a closed mind. China is a closed society with an open mind. And the fact that an Indian intellectual can see that the Chinese mind has opened and the West cannot see that the Chinese mind has opened is quite remarkable.
But might that also be because democracy is one of the pillars of Western thinking, and China clearly isn't a democratic country?
You're absolutely right. I mean, there is, one of the things I hint at in my book is that democracy worship is a sacred cow in Western thinking. And ironically,
You talk even about the iconization of democracy,
that's
right?
Iconization of democracy. And I believe, I've said this consistently, that in the long run, all societies have to become democratic. There is no alternative long-term destination. The destination is not in doubt, but the question is about the route. And the Western assumption, especially in recent times, has been that you can go from a non-democratic state to a democratic state overnight. History teaches us you cannot do it overnight. Indeed, if you look at the case of Russia, that went overnight from a communist party system to democracy, you saw an economic implosion in Russia. Living standards went down, infant mortality rates went up, life expectancy came down. The Russian people suffered. And indeed, if you want to understand why the Russians are so bitter towards the West, because, at a time when they were suffering in the 1990s, the West was saying, hey, Russia, well done, you're democratic. And, from the Chinese can think, the Chinese can observe how much Russia suffered from an immediate transition. And they observe the West cheering while the Russians were suffering. And they say, that's what the West will do to us. They will cheer when we also suffer. And, you must understand that from the Chinese perspective, if you look back over the last 200 years, the past 30 years have been among the best 30 years for the Chinese people. 400 million people, about the population of Europe, have been lifted up from poverty. That's a powerful gift to the Chinese people. And instead of applauding what the Chinese have done, Every day the Western media goes after China. Why don't you have democracy? Why don't you have democracy? And frankly, the Chinese are tired of listening to these lectures.
Do they tell you that?
Oh yes, of course. And I tell a story in my previous book, Beyond the Age of Innocence, Rebuilding Trust Within America and the World. A Chinese intellectual to me, one of China's most powerful intellectuals, said to me, Kishore, before Guantanamo, when the Americans came to lecture to us on human rights, we would disagree with them officially. But in our heart of hearts, we say, yes, the Americans have a right to lecture us. Their standards of human rights are here. Our standards are here. He said, after Guantanamo, everything changed. And the Chinese said to the Americans, excuse me, we beat up people, you beat up people, what's the difference? Stop lecturing us. First fix your own human rights record. And if you had told me, seriously, 10 years ago, that the first modern developed country to reintroduce torture would be United States of America, I would have said never. It could never happen. The unbelievable has happened. But what is even more stunning is that Western intellectuals still want to preserve the moral high horse and want to be able to give lectures to the rest of the world when their own record is now checkered. And the rest of the world, believe me, looks at this. They can see the double standards. And they say, please stop lecturing the rest of the world. The Chinese are thinking very hard about the future directions of their society. Premier Wen Jiabao says, yes, we know China has to change. Yes, we know that China has to become democratic. But their big challenge is, how do they go from the present system to becoming democratic while preserving the political stability? Because they need this political stability. In the Chinese mind, the biggest worry is not lack of freedom. The biggest worry is what they call luan, chaos. Because throughout Chinese history, there's been a tremendous amount of chaos. And the West doesn't understand this Chinese obsession with order. The Chinese obsession with order is a result of 2,000 years of experience, where you had centuries of disorder. They don't want to go through centuries of disorder.
So in the end, it's not the Westerns being afraid of China, but it's the Chinese being afraid of the Chinese.
The Chinese are afraid of disorder in China too. And that's why the Chinese want to change gradually. Now, the best way to encourage the Chinese to change gradually is to engage the Chinese. The more Chinese students, the more Chinese tourists who come to Europe and say, hey, why can't we have this in China too? They will be the agents of change. That's the kind of way you transform China. But if you feel good by boycotting China, you create a more closed China. Mao Zedong, you go back and read his statements. He said, it doesn't matter if there's a nuclear war between China and America. Because if you have a nuclear war, all the Americans will disappear, half the Chinese population will disappear, we'll still have half of China. That statement sounds like a Muhammad Ahmadinejad statement. Guess what? Nixon went to Beijing and shook hands with the guy who made the statement. So, what happened to China? China completely transformed itself. So why can't you focus on the society and not the individual? The strategic discourse in the West should focus on how the West should adapt. But this has not happened. To make matters worse, the West has gone from being competent to becoming incompetent in its handling of many key global challenges, from the threat of terrorism to climate change to keeping the nuclear non-proliferation regime alive. This incompetence, with naturally disastrous consequences, aggravates the Western sense of insecurity. We are therefore moving towards a real crisis in the management of our world order unless the West changes course. In reflecting on future strategic options, Western minds should reflect on the Chinese wisdom in translating the Western word crisis by combining two Chinese characters, danger and opportunity. Too many Western minds are looking at dangers, few are looking at opportunities.
You are in your book very critical about Europe, actually. One of the things you state is that Europe failed completely to spread its influence beyond its Christian heartland. Can you explain that?
Well, I mean, one of my obsession in my life today is what I call the world's great historical mysteries, okay? And, when after Europe developed, right, as you know, North America developed. And frankly, after that, after North America, if you go back and read the early 20th century history, everyone expected Latin America to develop. It didn't. Why? We still don't know. And if you look at Europe, if Europe was so successful, normally the success crosses the borders and other societies improve, right? But what's interesting is that the European success story has been confined to the Christian societies. And even though Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria are so near, there's been no transformation. Now you see the exact opposite in Asia. In Asia, the success of one Asian society affects its neighbors. And there's a continuous ripple effect. Japan's success led to the success of the Four Tigers, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. It led to the success of the Southeast Asian economies, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia. And then when Deng Xiaoping visited Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore, said, my God, why are these societies ahead of us? We must change. He changed China. And then when China took off, the Indians said, hey, if China can do it, why not us? We are as good. And so now the West Asians are saying, if India can do it, why not us? So there's a progressive process of learning. And in my previous book, which I mischievously entitled, Can Asians Think? I have an essay down there which suggests that Europe was actually very happy to remain as a developed state and to keep its neighboring Muslim populations in poverty. That was a very short-sighted policy. Not to export its modernization to its immediate neighbors, because the consequence of that is that I have a chart in my book that shows in 1950, Europe's population was here, right? And North Africa's was there. By the year 2000, it's about the same. By 2050, North Africa's population is much bigger than Europe. Don't you want to live next door to modern developed states rather than backward, impoverished states? Why can't you transform your own neighborhood? If Islamic states modernize, I quote a famous phrase by Bob Zalik, who said when he was Deputy Secretary of State that China should become a responsible stakeholder in the global order. And China, by the way, is becoming a responsible stakeholder in the global order because China today is the biggest beneficiary of the new global order. If you are the biggest beneficiary, you want to become a responsible stakeholder. Now imagine a world where all the Islamic states become modernized, they have middle classes, they succeed, they get rid of poverty. Guess what? They will then want to become responsible stakeholders in the global order. Take the obvious case of Iran, for example. The Iranians have long historical memories, okay? They believe that Persian civilization is on par with Chinese civilization. They believe that Persian civilization is superior to Indian civilization because they taught Indian civilization a lot from Persian civilization. Now, if you are living in Iran and you see China rising and you see India rising, you say, why not Iran? So the Iranians actually want to join the modern world. And guess what? At a time when the Iranians want to join the modern world, the West is putting them in a box, which is exactly the wrong thing to do. Get them out of the box. Let the Iranians connect with the rest of the world. And eventually, Iran will become a responsible stakeholder. Iran has got 60 to 70 million people. All the polls will tell you that the Iranian population is the most pro-American population in the Middle East. So why are you focused on Ahmadinejad and his crazy statements?
Because he's the representative of the Iranian people.
He's a temporary leader. But you know something? When President Bush declared Iran to be part of the axis of evil, you know who was the president of Iran then? Khatami. Khatami had proposed a dialogue of civilizations. And in response, you call Iran part of the axis of evil. Why are you surprised that Ahmadinejad was elected? When Iran was trying to reach out to you, you slammed the doors on them. Why don't you open the doors on Iran? Connect with Iran. Allow Iranian students to study in European universities and American universities as you have Chinese studying down there. And guess what? Over time, Iran will change. Believe me, that's why it's very important to get out of this Western mindset that the way you solve problems is by imposing sanctions. When you impose sanctions, you close up societies, they don't change. Why is it that the Europeans, who were geopolitically the most competent powers in the world, believe me, if you were not competent, how could a small state like Portugal, very tiny state, go and colonize South America, Brazil, go and colonize Africa, Angola and Mozambique, take a bite of India in Goa, take a bite of China in Macau? That's amazing. That's what I call first-class geopolitical competence. Today, the same European states which have been geopolitically competent for a long time are becoming geopolitically incompetent. And you know, if you look at the amount of time the Europeans spend arguing about the internal arrangements, about how to reshape Europe, and not paying attention to all the borders. The best analogy I can think of is that you're rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic while the Titanic is sinking. And that's not geopolitical competence. And the first priority in Europe should be try to figure out how to modernize the Islamic states in your neighborhood. And here, the best news that my book has for Europeans, and this is really good news, okay, is that the Islamic states never thought that they could succeed in modernization. But after observing what happened in China and in India and in Asia, saying, we too can do it. And the cover of my book, this is not a picture of Shanghai. This is a picture of Dubai. And I deliberately chose Dubai to send the message that the Islamic states are going to modernize like the rest of Asia.
Understand the fears in the West. People are afraid of losing their jobs, of losing their standard of living.
Yes, I can, and I think that the fears are justified. That with so much change coming, that they will have to adjust and adapt. And you know, it was a European economist, Joseph Schumpeter, who said that with capitalism comes creative destruction, right? So, for example, when the automobile was invented and mass-produced in America, the horse and buggy industry died. Why would you want to buy a horse and buggy when the automobile was invented? So as a result of more economies becoming capitalist, there will be much more creative destruction. And therefore it is natural that some economies that were competitive in Europe will not become competitive anymore. And so we have to adjust. So the message that we give in Singapore to our population is that we have to go through a process of lifelong learning and adjusting and adapting. And it's actually very cruel to the workers not to prepare them for this competition, because then you're creating an illusion. You're making them believe that they can do the same job from beginning to end. And that's no longer possible in the world of tomorrow. And so I can understand these fears and anxieties. But if as a result of these fears and anxieties, Europe and America become protectionists, then in the long run, we are all worse off. The big lesson we have learned is that protectionism doesn't work, open market economies work, and we have to keep working in adjusting and adapting in that direction. And there are many areas, by the way, there are many European industries which are still so far ahead of the rest of the world. I mean, you look at the German SMEs in machine tools, okay? The Germans are so far ahead of the rest of the world. It'll take a long time for anybody to catch up. And indeed, the German SMEs are exporting like mad to China and competing very well with China. So it can be done. But you have to adjust and adapt and make sure that you give up things like textiles, because you can't compete with China in textiles. It can't be done.
What will happen if the West fails to pick up your lessons?
Well, the West can fail in many different ways, okay? It can fail by resisting change. That will be one disaster. It can fail by becoming protectionist. That's another disaster. It can fail by maintaining policies that are perceived to be against the Islamic world. You know, the hardest message to convey to a Western audience is that the Western mind is a closed box, that it is caught in one cultural box and therefore cannot see the other cultural boxes that are becoming alive. So the first thing, the biggest message I have to the Western mind is, please open up your cultural box and understand that the 21st century will be very different from the 19th and 20th centuries. And you keep thinking that the rest of the world has got to adapt. No. The Western mind has got to adapt more than any other mind.